My name is Sarah Collins. I'm a member of the International Socialist Group in Scotland. This session is titled From Suffragettes to Slutwalk. We've got Kate Connelly speaking. Kate is a student at Queen Mary's University. She's writing a biography of Sylvia Pankhurst, which will be out in the spring, and she's a member of Counterfire. I'd just personally like to say that I think this is a very timely discussion that we're having today. In Glasgow last week we had the International Women's Day March, which Coalition Resistance organised. It was an excellent demonstration, and it was very much from grassroots activists, which I think showed a lot of potential in this idea today, so I really welcome this discussion. Just quickly, for timings, we're going to have Kate speaking for 20 minutes, then I'll open up the floor to questions and contributions for 25 minutes, and I'll bring Kate back in at the end. There's some stewards up at the back there. If you need to go to the toilet or anything, they'll let you know where it is. But I'll just hand over to Kate now.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. I want to start off by defining some terms for this discussion, and I think the two important ones are exploitation and oppression, and I'm just going to very briefly go through what these are. Exploitation is the mechanism by which capitalism works and which it uses to create profits for itself. And this is experienced when you go to work. And you'll notice that exploitation is happening when you go to work, because you go in there, you work there all day, and you come out with your wage. And somebody else goes into your place of work, or maybe doesn't. Usually they're not there for as long as you. Usually they go into a nicer office than you, and they do a lot less than you, and they come out with a lot more money. And that's, to put it very, very crudely, is exploitation. That a lot more money that they've got has come from the labour that you've done at work. And so that is something, exploitation is something that is experienced by the working class. Oppression works, I think, to distract people from this sort of grossly unequal plunder of the wealth in society, in this way, that if the majority of people are exploited, if the majority of people who do the work don't go home with the value of what they produced, it's easier to keep us divided amongst ourselves, fighting each other, because otherwise we might be looking at where the greater enemy is. And of course, oppression is something that affects affects groups across class. So you get things like racism, you get things like sexism, you get things like homophobia. Exploitation is something that is tied to a specific class experience. And it's the interaction between these two forces that I want to look at. Because oppression isn't experienced in the same way by all women, even though women can experience oppression. And I want to just explain this. I mean, it would be completely wrong to say that the sort of wealthy women in society don't experience any oppression. I think some of the most, sort of oppressive places in society can often be the places where upper class women are. And you see this, when you hear about sexism in the city and the experience of women bankers or women on boardrooms who experience, absolutely some really disgusting sexism. And you see this in the newspapers when these women take their companies to court and that kind of thing. But I think that is fundamentally different from the kind of experience that working class women have, which is compounded by that experience of exploitation as well. And so it's a totally different kind of oppression, I would argue, that working class women experience crowded housing, the stress of precarious work, low pay, the daily cooking and cleaning, caring for people, the unpaid labour that's done in the home as well. And if you can't afford ever to have a meal out or to go on holiday, that I think really changes your fundamental experience of oppression. But I think it also affects how you fight back against that oppression. The reason that you see women in the city taking their companies to court is precisely because they have to fight it as individuals. Because the people at the top of society are all in competition with each other. They can't have like a sort of bosses union or a union of women at the top of society, because they're all in competition with each other. They have to fight it individually. Working class women, on the other hand, are much more effective when we fight this collectively. And so I think that's the first important point that I want to make. And this way of fighting oppression is what I might call the secret history of oppression. And there's what I would argue is almost a secret history of the struggle against it that I'm going to talk about today. And the first example I'm going to give of this is the suffragette movement. And there's a lot that you know, will probably spring to your mind when you think about the suffragette movement. But as I say, I think there is a secret history of the movement, which is worth remembering here today. And you know, while people will sort of remember the high-profile stunts and the individual women that you're taught about in school and what they did, what you're generally not told about the suffragette movement is that the movement here in London started out as a movement which derived its tactics from the unemployment movement. In fact, the first arrest of suffragettes was a tactic directly taken from the unemployment movement. And the first branch of women who joined the militant suffragette movement in London was actually formed just down the road, and it wasn't initially a women's suffrage organisation. In fact, they were called the Unemployed Women of South West Ham. And another thing that you're not told is that at their meetings they used to sing the red flag. The first flag of the militant suffragettes was in fact red. And there's a minute book of these women who met down in Canning Town, not far from here. And it's in the Museum of London. If you read this book, it's an absolutely incredible document. But you really see the way that these women were interpreting the vote. And they interpreted the vote as something which could really transform their lives. You read the minutes and they're talking about how they need the vote to transform the housing conditions in their area, to fight against poverty. The vote was seen as something incredibly relevant and part of their everyday struggle as part of the movement against the oppression of the unemployed. This, however, was a view that was challenged by some of the other leaders of the suffragette movement, notably people like Christabel Pankhurst, who argued that the movement should ignore questions of exploitation and purely focus on the question of the oppression of women. And she tried to define it as a classless movement, and this ended up with the suffragettes had a newspaper called Votes for Women, and in this newspaper they said this: "If you have any class feeling, you must leave that behind you when you come into this movement. For the women who are in our ranks know no barriers of class distinction." Now really, this sort of argument meant that the Votes for Women campaign became kind of quite irrelevant to the women who were living in the East End, that the solution to their problems was effectively taken out of their hands. And the sort of middle class leadership of the suffragette movement argued that working class women were too weak to organise the fight back themselves, and what was really needed was influential middle class women to go to prison. That this would cause far more of a stir, and that they could do it on behalf of their poorer sisters, so the argument went. And so everything became reduced to the question of the vote. So much so that all the things women wanted to campaign about, they were told, oh, just wait till you've got the vote and then we'll change it then. Everything had to be reduced to the question of the vote. And so in a way it became, in some ways, quite a demobilising movement, because people were told, campaign just for the vote and then afterwards we'll address all of these social questions, but that is for later. And this argument leads you to a point when in about sort of 1910, where you see a big rise in struggle all the way across Britain. You see the Great Unrest, with these huge strikes in workplaces that never ever had strikes before. There was a huge campaign for freedom for Ireland. Actually, by this point, the suffragettes see themselves as competing against those movements and competing for space. And it was an absolutely real shame, because you saw that what happened is women in very poorly organised workplaces taking action for the very first time in their lives, really bringing the country to a standstill. And the suffragettes had nothing to say to these women, or certainly a section of the suffragettes didn't, because they were saying, oh, what you should be doing is not having these strikes, not be doing this, not be doing that. Basically sort of standing on the sidelines and shouting at these women and saying, no, you campaign for the vote first and then we'll address the questions that you're concerned about at work. And you imagine, I mean, this could have been these women that were coming out on strike for the first time, really trying to take control of their lives. Had the suffragettes, I think, had a different approach, I think, history could have been very different. You could have seen Votes for Women taken up by these women and could have connected with a much wider audience. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. Which leads me to Sylvia Pankhurst, who did decide to go back to the East End and start trying to link up with these women, very much against the policy of Christabel Pankhurst, who happened to be her older sister, which must have made for interesting meal times. So Sylvia Pankhurst went back to the East End and she linked up with these women, and what she tried to do was she didn't just start off from this, oh, you ought to be campaigning for the vote and ignore other questions that are important to you. She tried to make the vote relevant again, relevant to their lives and the fights that they were involved in. And it's really amazing if you look at the Women's Dreadnought, which was the newspaper that she produced and that she was, distributing round these streets. Round here, you see the first articles, and all these articles about a whole range of issues. There's a young woman she got involved called Florence Buchan, who was a jam factory worker who got sacked for being a suffragette. And she went round to all these workplaces where women were striking and interviewed them and offered their support, and they built real links between the movement for women's suffrage and the fight for better lives for working class people, and really made it a concrete social issue that was important to people. And it was so effective at making this an issue that really touched a chord with the local people, that you found the dockers working in the East London docks coming out to defend the suffragettes from police violence at their meetings, which was obviously an incredible thing. It meant that it touched a chord, sort of across the East End. And it's interesting because although the movement as led by Christabel Pankhurst was arguing that actually what was important, what would really strike a chord with the government is if you had middle-class, important women getting arrested and being sent to prison. Actually, one of the major turning points in the movement was when the Prime Minister Asquith, who was absolutely hated votes for women, hated the campaign, was totally hostile to it and refused to receive deputations of women. Actually, the one deputation that did force him to climb down and see them and talk to them was not the influential women. It wasn't the class of women that he would usually have mixed with. There was so much pressure put on him to receive a deputation from the East End that in the end, the deputation of women that he saw were women from this area, and they were brush workers and they were dockers' wives. And so in the end, this Liberal Prime Minister who resisted the demands for so long had to be face to face with these women coming in and talking about their lives. And I think it really shows sort of how important building that movement was. And I think, why am I talking about this now? I think today we face similar questions. And the questions that come up are things like, are you stronger fighting alone? And who do you ally with? And the reason that I bring this up, I want to refer to an article written by Naomi Wolf in The Guardian a couple of days ago. I don't know if people read it, but I thought there was a lot in that article that was very interesting. But she argues against making feminism part of what she calls a particular policy agenda. She explained what she meant by this, and one of the things that she said is Marxist feminists have made a similar mistake of tying things to a particular policy agenda, of saying you can't be a real feminist unless you join with the miners, the unions, the vegans. Vegans? Well, yeah, I haven't heard that one, but anyway, the miners and the unions. She says these are all great issues, but they are not feminism's necessary coalition partners. Now, for a start, I think this actually discredits the campaign of things like the Miners' Wives campaign, which was an incredibly important part of the miners' struggle, and also it wasn't a moral question that women decided to get involved in the miners' strike. It was actually it wasn't about getting involved with coalition partners. It was actually a defence of their community, something that women were integral to. And not sort of some little separate add-on bit, but actually right in the centre of. But also, I think an important point about this is that no women's movement has ever emerged in isolation from the wider struggles in society. If you think about all the women's movements, you think about how they've drawn strength from the wider struggles, from Mary Wollstonecraft, who drew inspiration from the French Revolution and the English nonconformists who were fighting for freedom of religion and religious expression. The first suffrage movement in this country and in America drew inspiration from the anti-slavery struggle. The second time round, as I've said, the suffragettes drew inspiration from the unemployment movement, and in the north of England from the textile unions. The very term women's liberation that was used in the 1960s was taken from the anti-imperialist movement in Vietnam. And if you think about the absolute raw courage of the women in the Egyptian protests, it came out on Egyptian Women's Day and have continued to protest despite the incredible violence and sexual harassment of the powers that be in Egypt. That's taken place in the context of the Egyptian revolution and the mass uprising there. And I think it's no coincidence that the Slutwalk protest, which, you know, after all was a global protest and did happen in cities all around the world, happened at a time when global street protests are really something that people feel they want to be involved in and have mobilised hundreds, thousands, millions of people. I think it's no coincidence, thank you, that the Slutwalk movement arose at a time when we've had a global anti-war movement taken to the streets, when we've had the Occupy movement taken to the streets globally. But I think, and this is going back to the question of allies again, I think it also raises the question of who the main enemy is. Now, if I go back to the comparison that I suppose is going to be my main one for this talk, the suffragettes, Christabel Pankhurst, by isolating the suffragette struggle and by not allying with the women who wanted to get involved in the Great Unrest, by not allying with the people that were struggling for Irish freedom, actually made those other campaigns the enemy, because they were all fighting for space and all sort of fighting for airtime, if you like. Whereas, and she actually argued that men shouldn't go out and demonstrate on the streets because they had the vote, and everybody else ought to shut up until women got the vote. So, you know, obviously that's not going to be something that appeals to people that have got things they want to demonstrate about and grievances that they've got. It's a very hostile attitude to take. For Sylvia Pankhurst, on the other hand, she saw that it was exactly the same enemy, and that's why they ought to start trying to make links with these other wider struggles. She saw that it was the same government that had attacked the strikers in the Great Unrest, who were the government that were ordering state violence against the suffragettes. She saw it was the same government oppressing the people in Ireland that were force-feeding women in prison. And so it's very much about not standing on the sidelines, but finding out about what's important to people's lives and then helping them to link up with the struggles. You know, if you want to build a union at work and there's somebody at work who's not yet in the union but who's facing racism or who's facing sexism, you have got to ally with them and you've got to fight their cause for them, and through doing that point out the importance of standing together collectively. It's no point saying, oh no, come back and talk to me about that when you've joined the union. You've got to prove those things in practice. And I think that's very much the sort of politics of Sylvia Pankhurst and where she was trying to take the feminist movement in her own time. And this question about linking up the struggles, I think, is where capitalism comes back in, because capitalism is very good at compartmentalising things for its own survival. Because if you do start to link up the struggles, if you do start to link things up, you see just how an abhorrent system it is. And I think capitalism is also very good at subverting and co-opting our own struggles to make another oppressed group, and not capitalism itself, look like the enemy. And I think this is a particular danger for us to be aware of today. If you just look at the justification for the war in Afghanistan and the way that was made under the guise of women's rights, well, it's a lie, of course, because women's rights haven't improved in Afghanistan. They don't care about women's rights, but actually it was justified under some kind of warped conception of feminism. And on the other hand, we're encouraged to blame Muslim women for wearing too much. You know, you've seen the recent hijab bans in France and the attempt to get feminists on board with this agenda, and instead of blaming a reactionary, basically Tory government in France, they're encouraged to blame mostly poor immigrant Muslim women in France, which is an absolute disgrace. And then on the other hand, you've got people, you know, the comment which sparked off the Slutwalks. You've got the copper in Chicago telling women that they ought not to dress like sluts because then they might be sexually attacked, basically implying that it's a woman's fault if she gets attacked because of how she's dressed. So you get blamed if you wear too much, you get blamed if you wear too little. Instead of blaming the politicians, instead of blaming the constant barrage of sexism that we face in society, you again turn around and blame other women. And I think, you know, you just think about how this pervades the whole of our society, this problem, and you think about things like pole dancing, burlesque, lap dancing clubs, all these things that my mum's generation saw as old-fashioned, as forms of kind of sleazy sexism, and things that actually people in my mum's generation thought that they'd got rid of as problems, have been rehabilitated into the mainstream and sold back to us as forms of emancipation, as forms of personal liberation. And there's a very interesting book written by a woman called Ariel Levy called, in which she defines this as raunch culture. And I think it's an absolute vile parody, basically, of everything that we've fought for, that you're supposed to achieve individual emancipation or confidence in your own body, essentially by viewing it through the eyes of others as a commodity that you've got no control over. Of course, it doesn't make any sense, but this is what we're told to think of, and it pervades all aspects of society, this way in which women are commodified. Women are used constantly to advertise things. I mean, you know, if you get a leaflet for a club night, it invariably has like a silhouette of a naked woman on it. And it even extends into the world of work. And you think about things like the Virgin Airlines adverts, which, you know, I think is one of the most vile adverts out there at the moment, and has been for quite a while, which consistently, you know, have women sort of like tearing their tops off in this kind of like, this is supposed to be this sort of, you know, seeing women who do this job as titillating. Even at work, there is this drive to have us viewed as sexualised objects, there for the gratification of others. And I think that, you know, it's absolutely wonderful that hotel workers have come out and demonstrated in solidarity with the woman who accused Dominique Strauss-Kahn of rape. And I think, obviously, you know, what happened there was absolutely vile. But I think hotel workers experienced the same thing. You know, being viewed there for the gratification of others, and, you know, we've seen where that led. And I just want to sort of come back on two things finally. For those that, you know, there are some people that say, oh yeah, but you come out with this because, you know, basically feminism's all about being anti-sex. And I want to say this. It wasn't people like Hugh Hefner, it wasn't the Playboy clubs that ever gave us liberation. Every single fight for more openness about sexuality came from struggle. You think about the suffragettes. They lived, like lots of suffragettes lived in openly lesbian relationships. They had women taking men's names, wearing male clothes, experimenting with all kinds of different ways of living. You think about the 1960s. People experimenting with new ways of living again. Women starting to talk about the sexual experience. People talking about orgasms suddenly. You know, all of these things people could now talk about publicly. And what they've done is they want to make a market out of that openness. They want to package it and sell it. And that makes women feeling insecure about how they look. You know, it makes men feel insecure about how they look as well. I think, you know, this is not just something that affects and warps one half of the human race, but, you know, I think it warps the whole of our society. There is you know, a pressure to perform sexually, and that's supposed to be, you know, one exact, you know, you do it like this and this and this. It's all very kind of, what's the word I'm trying to use? Sort of, it's all the same, you know, there's only one way of doing things, you know, as though it's, you know, a race in the Olympics or something. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous. And, you know, and this, you know, encouraging people to feel insecure about themselves sexually, about how they look, I mean, is actually, you know, a very good way of selling people more products to help them, but only temporarily, with their insecurities. And so, in fact, it's not about openness, what they're saying to us. You know, all this pole dancing, raunch culture is not about openness. It's the exact opposite. It's about closeness. It's about closing off our sexuality from ourselves. And so what I want to finish with is this. I think there is a tradition to reclaim. And that is a tradition that locates the fight for women's liberation in the fight for general liberation. And I think never has this been so necessary as it is today. You know, we face a nasty, vicious government that is attacking jobs, and particularly women's jobs. At the end of 2011, 22,000 out of the 28,000 newly jobless were women. We can see where, you know, in the public sector, the majority of workers in the public sector are women, and obviously the public sector is under massive attack at the moment. But so also are the services we use and the benefits we receive. You see that there was a report in The Guardian today saying that the cost cutting on interventions in domestic violence have meant that more than a half of probation areas are not using the Ministry of Justice approved interventions on domestic violence, but cheaper ones that haven't been approved and are not proved to be effective at all. And so you can see the way that this kind of cost cutting, this kind of austerity is really going to massively impact upon women's lives in a very unpleasant way indeed. And so I think that, yes, you know, fighting for women's liberation does mean being in a part of the struggle. It means being in the unions. It does mean seeing them actually as your natural ally. And I think it means being in the struggle against any more attacks on Muslim women. And I think it means also refusing to let them co-opt our struggle, which means letting nobody do it on your own behalf. I think we've got to fight for ourselves. Thanks.
Thanks, Kate, for that. We'll open up to the floor now for anybody who's got any questions or contributions. I'd really like to encourage anybody that's got a question, no matter if they think it's stupid or a small question, please do ask it. And we've got about 20 minutes for anybody to ask questions or make any contributions, so just take them now, and if you could come up to the table for the microphone yourself.
Somebody go over there.
Yeah.
Do you want to take the microphone and take it back in?
No, just come back.
Logistics. Okay. Hi.
Thank you. My name's Alex. I write for a.
If you stand away, stand in front, or anywhere out of the line of it.
Sorry, that's it. Yeah, my name's Alex. I write for a feminist website called What Glass Ceiling, and I'd like to talk to you about that after this. But basically, I was just wondering, you talk about how there's been a rehabilitation of this kind of raunch culture, and how women now are more kind of denigrated than they were about 30 years ago, and how, in a way, inequality has actually increased. Do you see that as well, I'm sure, I kind of think this is what you're implying, but you do see that as being parallel with the increase of inequality as a result of the changing economic systems between, say, the Keynesian consensus after World War II into this kind of neoliberal culture now. And how do you see the financial crisis as changing that now? Because that's another structure which has collapsed. How do you think thinking of what new structures might emerge? How do you think feminism and the drive for egalitarianism will be affected by that?
Put yourself at the back, and then yourself.
I was really interested about what you were saying about the secret history of the suffragettes, and I kind of see it as, secret kind of implies that there's no agency on why we don't tell these stories in society. I think there's kind of another secret history, but I'd say more that it's a kind of kept down history that they kind of don't tell us at school, which is about the kind of radical militancy of them. They they burnt down 56 churches, they tried to burn down MPs' houses, they went on, they would start at one end of the high street and they'd have these little hammers that were specifically designed so that they could, with the kind of least risk action, smash every single window on the high street, and they would do this in cities across in kind of coordinated actions. Which is something that, when you're told about Emmeline and Sylvia and Christabel Pankhurst, you don't really think about, and you definitely aren't told that when you hear about the militancy of kind of one hysterical woman who threw herself under a horse. And that's meant to kind of be the epitome or like the climax of that militancy, which I don't think is true. I was just wondering, when you're talking about kind of how capitalism can co-opt these struggles, and I think it was kind of obvious in the Slutwalk as well how it really tried to quickly put it through a lens, or kind of co-opt that struggle and sell it back to ourselves as us diminishing ourselves by claiming this word. I was wondering if you thought there was a space for more. How do you escape that? Can you escape that through more radical action? Can we look back to the militant history that is ours and reclaim that, and really go out there and kind of exceed the expectations of what a woman should do?
Yeah, I partially wanted to come back on the last contribution because I think it's really an important one. I think over the last couple of months we've seen a massive increase actually in people talking about the suffragettes. The N30 strikes actually had 70% of the strikers were women. And even at Miliband on March 26, when 500,000 trade unionists marched in London, even praised the suffragettes. During the students' movement, time and time students again used the suffragettes as an example of how to fight back. And I think there's two important things of how our struggles will not be co-opted. And the first one is to say that there are no separate paths to liberation. That means ultimately that women, black people, LGBT people cannot fight separately from the working class and from the working class struggle. There is no separate path to liberation, in a sense that if you fight by yourself, you will ultimately fail. And time again we saw how the movements in the 60s and 70s which arose ultimately failed in terms of addressing the very concrete problems that women face today: oppression and exploitation. you might have equal rights under capitalism in one form or another, but we all know that women are still worse paid. We still know that raunch culture is on the rise, and actually that puts the question onto the agenda of the alternative, of what kind of a system do we need. And that ultimately means that we need to be fighting for socialism. And the revolutionary socialist Lenin said that socialists are the tribune of the oppressed. And that means that socialists need to be putting themselves at the front line of all the fights against oppression and injustice, and ultimately seek to link all those different struggles against capitalism and against oppression together. And there's a very concrete example in history when the movement against abortion rights was at its strongest, and when we actually managed to fight back and actually win. It was in 1976 when the TUC called a mass demonstration against the curtailing of abortion rights, and it was when trade unionists and women marched together that we actually defeated the Tories. Because it isn't simply enough at a time when Theresa May says, I'm a feminist, and Tory MPs run around and say, this is, wear t-shirts with this is what a feminist looks like, to simply say, I'm a feminist. No, what we need to be putting forward is, we need to be saying, we're revolutionary socialists, we want to draw all the struggles against oppression together and ultimately smash this capitalist system, because ultimately it doesn't work in the interest of women, it doesn't work in the interest of men. And so ultimately our struggles need to combine together, and we need to look forward to that.
We've got yourself, then you at the back as well. Yeah.
Hello. I would like to remind one information that as of today, United Nations, World Trade Organization, and IMF, all of those organizations' reports and researches highlights millions of times that in the women in global north, which are coming from upper classes, are quite liberated from patriarchy, but all the women who are oppressed from patriarchy are mostly poor women coming from the global south women. So it's quite disappointing and sad to hear Marxist perspective, which is Marxist perspective to be very close to such bourgeoisie organizations since years and years. Patriarchy is almost usually conceptualized as an ideology, but capitalism is the economy who would be driving the change within the society. Unfortunately, this doesn't work in our reality. As feminists, as women, we have been reminded by Marxists millions of times that women have huge class differences between each other. So what do you mean by class? It's a bit tricky thing for me. If we really mean the Marxist concept of class, only 2% of private property belongs to women in worldwide level, according to 1995 numbers. And women bourgeois, if we talk about women bourgeois, it should be much more less than this 2%. But when we talk about upper class women, so we can talk about also class differences in that sense within the working class. But as feminists, we keep reminded by this class difference between women. However, there are many uniting experiences. Women can really be united within the struggle against patriarchy, which is a system equally important and deeply affecting women's life as much as capitalism. We don't live in a single system society. We live in a dual system society, which is patriarchal capitalism. And they are historically connected since the first day of capitalism. So we talk about class consciousness and class struggle, but men as a socially constructed group, they are oppressing women. And as of today, in UK, in this white upper class liberated country, 2 women are killed based on men's violence actually. The Muslim country where I am coming from, which is Turkey, 5 women per day are killed based on men's violence. So I hope Marxist movement and Marxist ideology and politics would acknowledge patriarchy, would acknowledge feminism, and a little bit stop teaching us, and a little bit stop acknowledging women's movement unless we fight against capitalism. If we fight against patriarchy, we have always been thought that we are on the wrong board, we are doing something wrong which will damage us. What should be done if we really would like to come together with women's movement, rather than working on a conspiracy theory against suffrage, Slutwalk and Occupy movement, we really work and explain how capitalism empowers patriarchy, and then women's movement can be anti-capitalist as well. Thank you.
Put yourself at the back there, and then yourself, if we, yep, you. If we could just keep the contributions quite short, because I've got quite a lot of people who've indicated that they want to speak, and we're running out.
Hi, quickly, I mean, I think patriarchy does exist for a simple reason, which is that the ruling ideas all the time come from the ruling class, and it benefits capitalism to propagate these ideas. And I think the fact that if you look at the average wage of a heterosexual couple, their wages are the equivalent of one male worker in, what, the 70s, Kate would know more, 70s, 60s. So actually, what capitalism benefits from that, because it's splitting the wage in two and giving half to the man and half to the woman. Although, and the domestic violence thing is, you know, absolutely that's true. Men do oppress women, but they don't benefit in the end game, because just to take that wage example, both sides are being screwed. So you have to have that. You have to unite on that. Just finally, I don't know if you saw this, Kate. The Newsweek magazine had an edition of the 150 most fearless women, and it included, of course, Hillary Clinton and Merkel and stuff like this, but it also had Tariq al-Kaman from Yemen, you know, and sort of lots of revolutionaries as well. So it's a very kind of contradictory thing, but it made a point in its editorial, which was that there seems to be a paradigm shift, that in America, in Texas, where 1/3 of women's family planning clinics are being axed, women are drawing inspiration from the Arab Spring women in their struggle for liberation. So I think Newsweek was surprised by this, but we shouldn't be surprised at this, because there isn't a sort of two-tier system where in the West we're doing relatively okay and in the developed world we're not. Because actually, when there's a revolutionary struggle, like in Yemen, like in Egypt, actually the direct experience of women there are of massive resonance to women in the West. But also that means that, you know, men should be supporting those struggles as well. But also on the left, we've got a long way to go. I mean, I wasn't surprised that the first 4 people that spoke in the morning session in the main room were men. That wasn't surprising. So even in the left, we have to take it very seriously. We have to actually organise meetings on these things. Women need to take the lead, and men need to support them in that struggle, I think.
Kate finished off by talking about the public sector, and she began by talking about the difference between exploitation and oppression. I work in an FE college, and where the cuts are biting, staff are told that they have to maintain standards. It's not a surprise that that leads to massive amounts of bullying, and the main victims of that are women. I'm a trade union caseworker. I currently have 4 examples in one college of women being bullied because they are women. Because it's felt that the manager, all the managers who are involved are men, and they say things like, you can't cope with aggressive boys, can you, in class, because you're too emotional, you know? Challenging the competencies of teachers and suggesting that they ought to put up with abuse from stroppy teenage boys. I've seen 2 women in public reduced to tears in a college which claims to be a healthy college. Now, I think what I want to say in a nutshell is this. I think we've got to take what Kate said today, not just see it as a way of understanding the question, but see it as a guide to action. Because if you just respond as a trade unionist, what this says, well, you need an anti-bullying campaign. I actually think we need to fight oppression. I think we need to fight sexism, institutionalised sexism. I think it's much more effective to generalise the experience of those bullied women to women right across the college, to show them that that men and women have to come together to fight oppression, and that oppression damages all of us. It's the wedge that managers tries to drive in between male and female workers in the departments to weaken the lot of us. And so, you know, that's my point really. For me, I am going to meet with the I have already arranged to meet with the managers to discuss institutionalised bullying. When we don't, I know what the response we're going to get, we've already had it, it's that the women have a perception of bullying. They're not really being bullied. Right? But my response is simply to accuse them straightforwardly of institutionalised sexism, to call a meeting, specifically for women workers across the college, not necessarily all in my union, but in all unions, and to talk about the way the cuts are affecting women in particular, about the way our managers are prepared to use sexism to divide the workforce.
Hello, my name's Ellie. I just really wanted to kind of pick up on what a couple of people have said, and what Kate said, I think, which was the most important thing about her talk, was actually, you know, this idea of like pointing to huge mass demonstrations as being a way for women to really start changing things. I think that was the most important thing, like Kate said, that the suffragettes and any other women's movement has done since. And I mean, it's something that we've noticed a lot more, I think, in the past few years, you know, especially with the rise of the austerity measures in Britain. You know, there has been huge mass demonstrations against it, and one of the things you notice immediately, if you take the huge strikes, for example, and big marches through central London there, was that it was so many women coming out, and this is women who often are, you know, maybe my age, like 22, 23, have never been on a demonstration before. Like walking in the road is a really radical thing to do, you know, carrying a placard is, oh, whoa, what am I doing? But it was really, really amazing, actually, I think, to see people doing that, because the fact is, for women in this country, like, you know, for the past 50 years, all of that power has been really, you know, gradually but very maliciously taken away from us. You know, as soon as the wars were over in this country, the world wars, all of the things that were provided for women so they could go out to work started shutting down. They used to have restaurants which were the same price basically as cooking at home, so that women didn't have to, you know, cook for children and go out to work and clean the house and do all of this kind of stuff. They were all shut down, and you know, now obviously women's benefits are being taken away. Child benefit is going to absolutely drive a lot of women into poverty, and then on top of that, of course, there's the constant policing, you know, of our bodies in every area of life. And you know, it's a really, really malicious way that power has been taken away from us, actually. And you know, it's not surprising that as soon as women are given the opportunity to fight, that they are there in kind of droves and hundreds of thousands, and actually leading struggles. And obviously, you know, it's not just struggles against cuts as well. You know, it is the struggle against war and against the police at home, actually, because women, if you look, they'll point to Afghanistan and Iraq and say, you know, women are so oppressed, what we need to do is go and intervene them so they can model a new society. And at home, when we have riots on the streets, it's women again that are pointing and saying, look, you know, these women are bringing the demise of society. They can't bring up their kids properly. You know, which is it? You know, women, the people that shape society, are the people that pull it apart, and they can't decide. It's absolutely awful, I think. But I do think that actually it's really, really inspiring what Kate has said, and I hope that the next kind of few years we'll see a huge swell of women doing that as well, and fighting against, you know, for example, the war in Iran that's imminent quite soon, and really being in the struggle. But because, to be honest, it is us that will live, you know, the raw experience and take the burden of all of the stuff, of cuts, of war, of racism. It is always women that are at the front of that, and it should always be women who are at the front of fighting back against it as well. So that's what I want to say, really, and really to back up what Kate has said. So thank you.
I'm going to say I've got 5 more speakers, but I think I've only got time to take another 2 before I bring Kate back in, because lunch is being set up in this room. But Kate will be here throughout lunchtime, and she can answer more questions then. Just bend it up.
Hi, I'm Steph Newton. I'd like to go back to what you said about women's rights in Afghanistan, because I thought that was very interesting, and I think there's a real danger in the fact that, you know, the ruling class are using classic divide and rule techniques to split our movement, and this is true for the women's movement, this is true for the LGBT movement. You know, a couple of months ago, Hillary Clinton, U.S. Secretary of State, addressed the United Nations and made a very inspiring speech about LGBT rights, and her underlying message that everybody managed to miss when they were sharing this very inspiring speech on Facebook and other social media websites was that we need more Western intervention, and that's ridiculous. And I think Hillary Clinton, we should tell her to look at her own country first. In some states, the fight for equal marriage is nowhere near even being talked about in mass media. In some states, LGBT people have a very rough time, and I think she needs to look at her own country first before justifying more imperialist intervention. And us as activists, we need to remember that we need to fight for liberation. It's part of a global struggle. We need to unite the liberation movement, and yeah, just basically.
Mine's just a pretty quick question. Just in relation to the Slutwalk stuff, there's been, I just would like to hear your comments on a lot of criticism that there has been, particularly from black women. I think quite a lot in America there's been some quite intense criticism, and I'd just be really intrigued to hear your comments about that, because I thought that was very interesting, and there hasn't been a lot of mention about that within feminism.
Okay, I'm really sorry to anybody that I didn't get to call, but I'm just going to bring Kate back in now to answer some of those questions.
5 minutes, yeah. Okay, right. I'll try and cover things, and then if I don't, come and harass me later. So, yeah, the first question was about neoliberalism and the effect that that's had, and I think this has been really interesting, actually. I think neoliberalism, the idea that the market can go everywhere, can go into places where we hadn't previously even dreamed the market could go, did also extend into women's lives as well. And this idea that absolutely everything in your life itself, your body could be up for sale in ways that you never imagined, was part of the neoliberal onslaught. And I think alongside neoliberalism came the sort of postmodernist argument, if you like, that like all the old grand narratives, all this stuff about class and gender and all that, that's all really old-fashioned and it's all over, and you've got Tony Blair getting up and saying, oh, we're all middle class now and stuff like that. And when people start coming out with these things, this is when alarm bells should start ringing, really. And nobody can kind of seem to pinpoint this exact day when class oppression or gender oppression was over and became passé. They can't quite remember exactly when it happened, but everybody seemed to have sort of missed it, but was then told, yeah, it did happen, you weren't awake that day. So, clearly these things have not gone away, but I think that was an argument that was really pushed and became quite successful, with the neoliberal onslaught. I think with the crisis, and I think what happened actually was a lot of the myths became exposed, and the veil was sort of torn off. Some of those myths that everybody's middle class now was shown to be so false and so hollow. And the same with the oppression of women. I think this government have done very well at showing that all of these oppressions are still alive and well, and they're going to be driven from the top. So I think that the crisis has kind of revealed for a lot of people the system and the way that it works, and it is very interesting now that you get on the news people talking about capitalism, yet talking about the system in a way that you never did before. I mean, I know Terry Eagleton makes this point that previously, before the crisis, people would talk about Western society and liberal democracy and all these euphemisms. Now people talk about the beast for what it is, and they talk about capitalism, they talk about profits, and they talk about exploitation. And I think that's extremely important. The system has been exposed, and we can see it as something that's not eternal, that's not a part of our human nature forever, but as something which is messing up our lives very much in the here and now, and something which ought to be replaced. That's the one side of how the crisis has affected women, but also I think what will be happening as well is that this very nasty argument that we can't afford women's rights anymore, that women's rights, is part of the sacrifices we've got to make with austerity, is going to come to the fore. You see this with, we can't afford disability rights, we can't afford rights for all these people, as though there's some sort of indulgence that was sort of, once given to us. I think that argument will very much come to the fore, and be something we have to be alive and aware of fighting. Yeah, in terms of the Slutwalk, I can see why it came in for criticism, and I think there's sort of different ways of seeing this. My approach was that it was great that people took the initiative and went out on the streets to protest against what was an absolutely appalling comment, which effectively tried to blame women for sexual violence. I don't think, I think some people the thing about it was very disparate. So people went on that thinking, I think, a lot of different things with a lot of different reasons behind it, which is a good thing. But I think some people went on those demonstrations arguing things like, oh, we think you can reclaim the word slut, and stuff like that. I personally don't think that words can be reclaimed. I think words have a context, words have a history, and I don't think we can deny that. And I think actually, going back to that kind of idea of the sort of postmodernist argument that, all these oppressions are in the past, I don't think they are, and I think they are bound up in the words that we use. And I think we should be careful about how we use them. So I personally wouldn't have called it that, but then I think actually, you know, the reason it was called that was to say, you know, it doesn't matter how you dress. It's not women's fault for being attacked. And Ellie got up and spoke earlier, and you know, one of the things that she was involved in organising on that demonstration, which I thought was really important in terms of shaping that debate, was the hoodies, hijabs and hot pants block, where women were wearing all of those different clothes and saying that it wasn't about how you dressed. You know, it was never your fault that you get attacked. I thought that was a really good way of taking it and a good way of intervening in that movement. In terms of patriarchy, I mean, I think I did sort of deal with it in my talk, but I think that you can ally with men. I don't think that men inherently are predestined to oppress women. I think capitalism is a historical phenomenon. I think the reason we see appalling rates of domestic violence and oppression in society is because the way society is structured, it encourages sexism, and I think it comes from that. I don't think it comes from something innately in men. And also, I think the argument can be won. I think we can build a better society, and I think we shouldn't sort of give up on that vision. And I don't think I did diminish the sexism that women at all levels of society can experience, but I do think that the most effective way to fight back is by building the movements of the broadest possible unity. And and this is where I want to sort of finish really, the woman that spoke about how do you escape the kind of diminishing and the sort of a really nasty patronising attitude that she talked about that came around, you know, the way the slutwalks were approached. And you did get these newspapers sort of saying, oh, it's just women that want to wear their underwear, and let's laugh at that, or let's find that slightly tittillating, and a really, really disgusting attitude to women who are marching over this issue. I think the thing is that we can't inevitably escape that. I think that you will always get them, the sort of Murdoch media, if you like, and those sort of people trying to diminish our movements from below. But I think the way of combating that is to get out onto the streets, is to combat that with mass action, because there is that thing, when you go on a demonstration and you go home and you turn on the television, especially when you go on your first demonstrations and you turn on the television, you tell everybody that you've been on it, and it's just not there, and you're like, but there was thousands of people, there were, honestly, and there's like no coverage of it at all. I think with things like the anti-war movement, after demonstration, they got bigger and bigger and bigger. Everybody knew someone on those demonstrations. Actually, the disparity between what the media were parroting and the reality that people actually knew about because they participated in it became so huge that actually the media had to start to make up for lost ground and tell some of the truths about the movement. And I think that is part of the way that we can win back respect, is by getting out on the streets on the biggest number possible, by mobilising the biggest number of people possible, so that people really know the reality of what these struggles and what they're about.